Hello, everybody. Let me tell you a story. One time, someone came to Jesus with a message. Your friend, Lazarus, is dying. Jesus knew Lazarus. He knew Mary and Martha, his sisters. He knew who Lazarus was, and he cared a great deal for Lazarus. So he took his disciples and began to make the journey over to Bethany to see Lazarus, his sick friend. By the time that Jesus had gotten there, Lazarus was dead. They had already laid him in a tomb. He couldn't drive there. He couldn't have flown there. He had to take some time to get there. And Lazarus had already been dead for a few days. One of Lazarus's sisters said to Jesus, "If you had only gotten here sooner, Lord, he would have lived." And Jesus wept. Now, if you know the rest of the story, you know that Jesus got up from weeping and called Lazarus out of the tomb. That Lazarus came up out of the grave and shed off his grave clothes and continued to live. He would later die, but he continued to live for an extended time. That Jesus raised him from the dead is quite a magnificent story. It's one of the stories that is right before Jesus's own death and Jesus's own rising from the dead, not simply a rising from the dead, but a resurrection to life after death. But I want to talk about this short verse, one of the shortest verses in the Bible. These simple two words: Jesus wept. Why did he weep? He wept because he cared for Lazarus, yes, but if he knew that he was going to call him out of the grave, then why did he weep? He wept because there was other people sad. If you've ever been to a funeral of someone maybe that you didn't even know, the sadness of the people who did know them and did care for them makes you weep. But Jesus knew he was going to raise them from the dead. Why did he weep? I think that Jesus wept for all of those reasons. That he cared about Lazarus, that he cared about Mary and Martha, that he cared about the people gathered there, and he cared about his disciples who likely knew Lazarus too and was grieving with them. He was giving honor to Lazarus. When a loved one dies, the grief is there to give them honor, to show that we cared, to show that we were there. But I do think there's a deeper reason why Jesus wept. Just as there's a deeper meaning in a lot of things in the Gospel of John, Jesus wept because of the despair around him. Jesus wept, I think, in part because of the statement, if you had got here sooner, you would be alive. You see, he wept because the world is in such a way that people despair. That when push comes to shove, knowing that Jesus has this power, knowing that Jesus is connected to a God that gives life, they still despair. If you would have only acted sooner. Jesus weeps because there is a darkness in the world that drives us to despair. That death is a final note, that death is somehow always out there as an enemy unconquerable, as if God is somehow secondary in power to our mortality and to the things that drive us toward despair. Jesus weeps because he has hope that he wants so badly for the people of the earth to have. We've been through a lot. We've been through a lot of confronting our mortality in these days. Do not despair, because Jesus is calling us out of the tomb of despair, that we might shed off our grave clothes, that we might come out of sin and shed off the old things that were holding us down into despair, into hopelessness, into not loving God with our whole selves and not loving our neighbor as ourselves. Jesus is calling us out of the tomb of sin, and Jesus is calling us out of the tomb of despair. And Jesus weeps for a world and a church that still despairs, even on the other side of the resurrection. And it is confronting to me, and it is encouraging to me that Jesus cares so deeply that we have hope, so deeply that we know life and life eternal and life in resurrection in his name, that he weeps on our behalf. But he does not weep and then do nothing. He weeps and then he calls us out. He weeps and then he shows us how life can be full and whole and holy. That's not to say that we should just ignore the troubles of this year and the last couple of years here. This doesn't say that we shouldn't lament, that we shouldn't weep as well, that we shouldn't join Jesus in crying tears of lament, that we live in a world that is so burdened by these things, burdened by mortality, burdened by a pandemic, burdened by a world that often turns to hopelessness, a world that often turns to violence, a world that often turns to pitting one another against each other. We weep for that too. But we join in with Jesus in calling out words of hope. Jesus called Lazarus out of the tomb. Jesus, in his dying breath, forgave the people that put him on the cross. Jesus came out of the tomb too and lives at the right hand of God forever. And that should give us hope. On the other side of resurrection, we should know and affirm that while we weep for the troubles of the world, take care and have hope, for God has overcome the world. And God is bringing the kingdom, and God is bringing life, and life abundant through Jesus. So be encouraged, church. Don't despair. There is nothing that can overcome God. There is nothing that stops Jesus from reaching out and calling us out of the tomb. Jesus wants life and light to shine in the darkness. And we as the church reflect that light to the world. So join Jesus in weeping for the situation that the world is in, and join Jesus in echoing his call for the dead to come out of their tombs. Go in his grace and peace today.